Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar talk. My name is Jing Han. I'm the director of the Institute for Australian Asian Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Barramatical people of Darug Nation, whose ancestors have been the traditional owners of their lands for thousands of years, and pay our respect to First Nations elders, past and present. Over the last 6 years, I have worked with many artists and creative minds, and I can say that each and every one of them is different, and each has their own artistic journey and a very individual story, which I found fascinating and enlightening. So we are very excited in launching this new talk series, Artist Story, inviting artists of diverse backgrounds and at various stages of their careers to share the stories of their journeys, their roots, challenges, breakthroughs, and moments of self-discovery, and shed light on how their creative minds work. And most importantly, to inspire younger generations to pursue their artistic dreams and to connect us all through the power of creativity and our shared humanity. Our inaugural guest is Chris Yee. Chris Yee is a Sydney-based artist, illustrator, designer, and animator. I first met Chris in late 2021 when we had a group show that included Chris. Back then, he was a bright rising star. And in a short span of 3 years or so, Chris has made great successes in art creation, including commissioned public art and art and brand design in the commercial sector. He has also created an extensive portfolio of animation work spanning commercial projects, music videos, and artistic installations. Now, please welcome Chris Yee to tell his story.
Hi, everyone. How's it going?
Good.
Thanks for the kind words, Jing. Very, very lovely. But yeah, much like Jing said, I'd love to share and sort of have transparency with my not very conventional career. So please, any questions or anything along the way I talk about, please drop a note or a question. I'd love to answer it towards the end. But yeah, love to. Thanks for making time, everyone. I really appreciate it. Okay, so yes, I'm Chris Yee. I'm an artist, illustrator, animator, some director, producing, and installation artist. So a bunch of slashes, but everything's been very, very unconventional. So hopefully you can relate to something or something that inspires you along the way. And once again, I love transparency. So any questions, feel free to ask me, towards the end. I'd love to help out. So my story begins in 1989. That's how old I am, and that's when I was born. My family was a very nuclear family. It was my father, my mother, my older brother Mike, my twin brother Andrew, and myself. And we were very, very common at the time, very nuclear. And my dad was he migrated from China to Fiji to Australia. He had a family of 7, a really big family. And at the time, he was the only one sent to university. So it was up to him to really, set the precedent for our family in Australia and our life and our future. So he was a banker and a pretty successful one, but a lot of that changed in 1998. He sadly passed away from lung cancer. So my mom, who was a stay-at-home wife, had to suddenly be, in the 90s, had to suddenly sort of take responsibility and look after 3 of us, which is really chaotic. So uh, we didn't quite know our identity. At the time, our dad wanted us to be very much, very studious. And I know he was very typically strict at maths and that kind of thing to us. But we really we're just like wild boys just trying to figure out ourselves at the time, with his mom trying to figure herself out as well and get back into the workforce. So where was our family? Where did we really sit? Where did our identity lie? So without a really strong male father figure, we looked into fiction like most of my friends did at the time. So wrestling, we're really big into wrestling, fighting games, Japanese, anime, manga, things that are really popular now. But to us, these were like our sort of weird male father figures, which kind of inspired us in our creativity. So we grew up in Eastwood and Ryde. And this was Eastwood back in the 90s. It was, there was no creativity allowed. It was chaos. No, no, not at all. Eastwood is a very Asian Australian suburb. If you haven't been there before, predominantly Chinese Australians and now Korean Australians. And I currently live there. So my mom still lives in Ryde and I live in Eastwood. So it's just a stone's throw away. And, luckily this is Eastwood today. Beautiful, a utopia. It's amazing. So everyone should come visit. But yeah, definitely this hub for Asian Australian culture, which I'm really proud about. So such growing pains. So at the time, I didn't really know what to do after year 12. Most of my friends, because of where I grew up, fell into becoming bankers, lawyers, doing a lot of mechanics and trade, which as an adult is really, really helpful. But it was something that I didn't really want to do at all. I wanted to be creative. Me and my brothers used to draw, spend time together, and that's how we used to sort of bond and kind of be good kids and good brothers to each other while our mum was off at work. So after year 12, I ended up studying at COFA, so the College of Fine Arts, which is UNSW's art offering and design offering. And at the time, because of my family and the pressure, I wasn't brave enough to go into art, which I really loved. I loved art and illustration. It was my hobby. So I ended up, signing up to design because it felt like a real job. It felt like something with a salary behind it. So, which wasn't true. So I ended up studying and majoring in textiles design and graphic design, and graphic more so because I loved drawing, and textiles because I just tried to find ways to implement drawing into it. So throughout my whole design, career as a student, this is my highest achievement. I was very, very shy, very quiet. I got like a mouse, as you can see, just sort of shy there in that picture. But I drew my way through the course, used my illustration as a way to sort of, understand ornamentation and graphics, and I kind of won this big competition at the time, and they produced this rug, and I got my first sort of look at making money as a creative. It's really inspiring. At the same time as juggling my my studying, I was drawing these really chaotic punk drawings. I was like 18 to 19. And, I taught myself how to draw with my brothers, being influenced by comics and manga. And, I just sort of like had this sort of weird punk edge to myself. It wasn't really reflective of my personality, but I just loved ink. And I kind of taught myself how to use these calligraphy brush pens. They sell at Kinokuniya right now, actually, these Pentel brush pens. And, I was subconsciously telling myself how to use line weights, shadow, black and white, and these things that I was subconsciously learning from my reference and my inspirations as a kid, but also just drawing as a hobby. And I started to get myself some sort of notoriety. So after these punk drawings, at 19 to 20, they evolved to more character work, comic and graphic work. And I started to sort of make these little comics. And while I was studying at UNSW, I actually had a part-time job at UCID, my first job ever, funnily enough, in the photocopy department. So if anyone here was, using Fisher Library at the time, I probably would have helped you photocopy. And I was making these little zines, black and white zines from my drawings and giving them out to people on campus and sort of getting a bit of notoriety and just, a bit of just people knowing that I could draw within Surrey Hills and the community that I was in at the time. And this is before Instagram, so it was very much, brick and mortar, physical copies go a long way. And I still do think they go a long way. So yeah, I was just sort of making a little products of myself and giving out for free to show people essentially my portfolio. So that got me known within the skate community, which is really big at the time, surf and skate. So I had my first gallery show, which was actually run by this guy who had a skateboard brand on Oxford Street. So I was really, really lucky to have this. And this show was, must have been 13 to 15 years ago, but it was all these illustrations I did just out of a hobby, and it was 150 drawings just hung up. I sold them all for like $20, which I kind of regret now because I spent so much time on it. But it was a really good way to get myself known and to feel like, being a design student, that I could sort of have a placement in art. And this was my, juvenile, but my work at the time, which really reflected what I liked and just, made me feel a sense of place and identity. And then following this, funnily enough, I was still living in Ryde at the time at my mum's house. I started getting work from surf and skate brands at the time. So Hurley, Piping Hot, Macbeth. Uh, my first job was actually Hurley, which is really nerve-wracking. But at the time, I was drawing because I really liked that style and this punk style, these punk bands and stuff like that. But myself and my upbringing, I knew nothing about surfing or skating. I still can't. I know nothing about it. But I sort of like, faked my way into it and sort of, but I did feel my first sense of, understanding a real brief and how to be a commercial illustrator. So it was interesting. And there were some design elements, but it was really about my personal work, paving my own path and just getting myself known. This is so following that, I actually, at the time, because everything comes in trends. Right now, if there was a trend, it might be tattooing. Everyone's into tattooing and doing their own tattoo setups. But at the time during university, graffiti was really big. Everyone wanted to be a graffiti artist. Companies wanted murals. So I started to be a fake graffiti artist. So I learned how to spray paint. And this is me just still trying to find my identity and who I was, as an artist. So I started getting a lot more mural-based jobs and learning spray paint. And I thought this is my identity. But it didn't feel quite right still. And that Vans picture, actually, I painted that paintball. I got a really bad sunburn on the back of my neck, which still is kind of there, which is a bit worrying. But yeah, I was not a professional graffiti artist. So whose story was I telling? I had this design degree. I spent money on it. I was like, hey, I've got to design. I got to give it a go. This is something commercial. I can't just draw, even though I love drawing. And also drawing wasn't making me enough money. It was something that was still quite a hobby, but it was sort of fractional. I was kind of juggling both. So whose story was I telling? So at the time, in context, web design was really popular. Now web design isn't as popular because of Squarespace and all the accessibility we have and apps and phones. But at the time, and it sounds crazy, like I remember a website could sell for $30,000 to $60,000, just some random design work, which nowadays is you'd be laughed at if someone told you that. But essentially, I worked for a design company, and obviously my design is lacking. But I got through by sort of shining my illustration skills as a way to sort of backdoor and get these jobs. So I remember there was a Sakata job I did, and I had to illustrate. It's always like a brief and a problem solving mission. So it was like, how do I make these snacks have personalities? So it's drawing that in, and I learned a lot from that. Following that web design job, the company I work for, they always sort of sold me as this illustrator as well as a designer, but illustration was like the X factor, I guess. So I remember one of my first jobs was with Doritos, with a big job. And this art director at the time was like, hey, can you create a character? We want Poochie from The Simpsons, which is like this fake Bart Simpson thing they made. And this is what he thought was cool. Mixed it with Godzilla, which just came out at the time. It was like a new version of Godzilla. And this is what I came up with. This really ugly Doritos chip with a hat and these tiny beady eyes and this kind of terrifying teeth. And this is the result. And, this is something that as a professional designer or illustrator, you're always sort of learning how to work with amendments. It's not your work, it's someone else's story. It's about compromise. And as a young person, as a 20-something-year-old, I really learned a lot about how to be professional, putting on a different hat, making work that wasn't mine. This led to a scenario of this demonic kind of chip in different situations. I don't know if they tell you this anymore, but using the color red isn't really wise for screens and phones and TVs. But Doritos like just wash the whole thing with red, so it looks like there's chips in hell, which is really weird. And it's just like this storytelling element of illustrating Doritos through Australian time, which obviously is not accurate, but it's something that learning a brief and learning, taking notes and learning how to sort of problem solve is such a big step with me. And it's something that I think bleeds onto my greater life and as an artist too, to get things done. So I'm really thankful for these weird commercial jobs early on. Following that, doing a lot of commercial illustration now. So now design is sort of pivoting into illustration a lot more. I ended up working for this brand called Paul Frank, which is kind of cool again. but it's a 2000s brand. And I actually worked with them for 2 years, 2 and a bit years, freelance on contract basis, but it was kind of like a retainer. So it was kind of my first experience that, um, I was still working part-time design job. I think still the photocopy room a bit, but then this was like a retainer where I was like, oh, I can actually do this part-time and be pretty consistent with money, which was, a big thing from a single parent family like that, and not really experiencing that. So Paul Frank's a challenge. It says monkey. And if you look at it at first glance, you're like, hey, what is the expression? How can I design around this logo? It looks like it's smiling, but it's really quite blank. It reminded me of this Hilary Duff album cover when I was younger. At first, you look at Hilary Duff and you're like, she's happy, right? But you really look into her eyes and mouth, she's kind of grinning, sad. It's this blank emotion. And so it's like, how do you deal with this as a creative? What do you do? So it's funny. I got sick of looking at this monkey's face. I drew it over, it was, the main client was China. So we did 200 designs in 1 year. And I remember like, if you're ever into fashion design and seasons, usually there's 4 seasons, like the real world for fashion designs. But with China, there's 12 seasons. So say, for example, Halloween or Christmas would be a whole range of clothing, textiles, jumpers, because the market is so much bigger. So working at this sort of pace for fast fashion, I learned a lot to sort of compromise as well, but then how to churn out designs as well as, I guess, a range of design language and illustration language, which wouldn't be my own. So it'd be a punk line work, something more colorful and layered, something a bit more minimal. But I did learn a lot. And it was kind of cool because my textiles degree kind of came into play, I guess, but I was really just drawing. So, a bit of that stuff I learned did come into play, but it was really about drawing and just trying to like, you're working at such a rapid speed, you're making quick decisions, but, hopefully you understand what the client and the story is. So it was really fun, actually, in hindsight, but I remember it was just like, I think 24, 25 at the time, it was like a really fast-paced, hectic schedule. Which actually got a bit more hectic in the future, which we'll get to in a few more panels. So working with Paul Frank, it's a subsidiary company of a larger family of brands because it's fast fashion. So I ended up working with Harley Davidson, which is great. And once again, them knowing that I was an illustrator, doing a range of different art styles for this product, to sort of advertise this bike, which is really fun because as a fan of illustration as a whole, and lowbrow art or pop art, I could really just give different things a go. And at the same time, I was drawing through Photoshop and doing digital work, which, just as a side story, I started drawing ink when I was younger because at the time to be an illustrator, you wouldn't be taken seriously if you could draw digitally. It was really about having an ink portfolio or having like a pencil test or going to an illustration school. But now we all know in 2025, everything's digital, everyone wants changes, that rule book's out the window. And I've kind of followed my career that way, gone with the technological changes for the storytelling and for the client. So also Power Rangers was owned by that company too. So, it's funny, like I really got to live out some of my dreams and inspirations. I was a big fan of this pop culture stuff, and to be able to draw and come full circle and draw for clients for Power Rangers was like kind of a shocker to me. But that was a really fun exercise. And as you can see, I sort of changed my style once again. It's always being a chameleon as a commercial professional for the client story, but it was definitely not my core language. A really big milestone for me was this job here, which was for Sony. I worked with them twice. And as you can see, the left-hand side is this airbrush Photoshop drawing, sort of painterly look I sort of did. And the right-hand side is far more of my true style of what reflects my comfortability at the time. And I'm really young here, and I was advertising that weird camera put to my head, which is not in existence anymore. They stopped marketing it, but it was their GoPro. And but it was fun. They let me do this. And one of the art directors of the company caught wind that I could draw with ink, which was, my core skill, I guess, if was any way to say it. And I drew this live in 2 days, I think a 2 day span. all these Sony products just freehand. So it was a fun one. But just seeing the two different styles within one company, it was cool. I got to sort of spread my wings and give things a go. And I got my friends involved. My brother's there shooting. He helped produce the video, and my friend Will is now a director and actor, and he helped shoot it as well. So it's good to work with friends. Something I try to do in my career, which will come to fruition later on in the talk. So somewhere else. So, I was doing this sort of commercial work and at the same time doing my personal drawing, but a lot of my career really shifted in 2016, I believe, when I got an email, or 2014, sorry, an email from Mad Decent. And at the time, they were a really big record label I was actually a fan of. They're based in America, and it's owned by the DJ Diplo. So Diplo's work with Justin Bieber, Skrillex a lot of artists in the 2000s era. And I don't know if he's still popular these days, but at the time he was really big. And I got an email, before Instagram, an email that said, hey, these DJs, oh, sorry, Zed's Dead from Canada, we manage, really like your work. Could you work on their EP release? And, this is like an American client. And I was like, oh my God, like, I'd love to. Yes, nervously, a million times, yes. So then I quickly, within 2 weeks, designed the EP cover for their first release under Mad Decent and, their single cover. And they had Diplo, the DJ, the owner of the label, as part of the record. So to me, it was a massive, massive feat. And I was like, hey, if this is where my freelance career stops, I'm happy. I did something that's, music. And at the time was so cool. But they were dubstep artists, and I'm not a massive fan of dubstep, but I was flattered. It was such a big thing for me at the time. So then after doing this album cover, they were like, hey, Chris, also, can you do an animation for us, a music video for the release? I was like, oh, I'm just drawing in Photoshop. But straight away, I was like, yeah, for sure. What do you want? It's like, yeah, can we do an animation within 3 weeks? We have to release it in 3 weeks. I was like, yep, sure. So I said yes. And then nervously, I went to YouTube and typed in how to animate from Photoshop. So then in 3 weeks, I created this music video, my first animation ever. And I learned off YouTube. So luckily, I had my Photoshop core to animate, but then I quickly learned how to use After Effects. And I just learned how to animate just madly. So it was like a heist, like a bank heist. So I did this music video. It's much aligned with the Riots and the album cover and what they liked at the time. And, as you can see, if you're a fan of animation, it's pretty simple now in hindsight. But then, it was so big for me. It's like I never thought I could animate or be asked to animate. It's such a big step. So then following that, I've been working with that record label now for the last 10 years, 10 plus years, no, 15 years or whatever it is since then, as a freelancer, just doing different posters and cover arts and, all through this lens of dubstep, which is something I never thought musically I'd be in tune with, but I've been able to do these cool illustrations. And, the awesome thing about dubstep or the electric music scene is that there's no brief. As you can see, it's all just graphics, which, as an illustrator, you're telling a bunch of different stories and different styles, but it could be really fulfilling and, quite adventurous. And working with really great artists too. So as you can see, it's great. Like I did some album covers, some stage design, laser design, and all because of the music video as well, they allowed me to do animation for their work. So it took a lot of my work commercially like this as an art director and a lead illustrator across the world through this lens of music, which I'm still doing these days. And they're really good people, really good. They're really friendly and really open-minded. And as you can see with the posters, have no real direction. The direction is anything, which is really fun. So then that led to a career of doing animation and music videos. So following that, I got caught wind quickly that I did this music video, and it got me doing music videos for big clients like Justin Bieber, Sam Smith, directing Tones and I. And this is all within, following 2015 onwards, going into the music industry and then becoming a music video director. So, through the lens of illustration and trying to tell their stories. And as you can see with animation, there's so many different styles. It's kind of like how I approach illustration, but it's really style, colors based on the client or the musician per se, and what they think that the song is, or their vision of themselves are. So I've been really lucky to do animation and music videos chasing that one little release and that one little throwing caution at the wind and giving it a go. So following that led me to music videos, and the music industry led me to advertising, which is still kind of my bread and butter now, just because it's very similar, where it's for a client, it's for a product, and it now led me to directing. So this is my first car ad I was able to direct. Obviously, animation is a big part of it. It was shot during COVID, so during lockdown. We had to sort of sell it to the client and get it signed off and approved. But the funny secret about this is that, oh, sorry, starting off, I got my friend as an AD. My brother helped write the treatment, and the painter was actually a close friend of mine growing up in Eastwood. But the secret about this is that I can't drive. So I don't know how I got the job. So I guess I just didn't tell them. So I pitched everything about this concept of during lockdown, traveling, when you can't travel, the dream of this car taking you somewhere else, but they never knew I couldn't drive. But much like my career, one thing leading to another led to a whole slew of other car ads. So following that, I've done a whole bunch of car ads since. And yeah, I guess I'm still selling. It's still a vetting process, where it's like most of these commercial jobs, you still have to sort of get to a big meeting, talk to a bunch of corporate people and sort of say why your story is important and why it's creatively effective. But, they still don't know I can't drive. And I still can't drive, which is, how sad is that? I should be able to drive. That's more so my fault. I just have been too lazy and too busy drawing, I guess. Yes. So, one thing leading to another is definitely the crux of my career. So taking it back home, I guess it was all fine and dandy, doing commercial work, but it's probably not how a lot of you may know me, or how I don't know how Jing knows me. It's really through the work that resonates with me the most, right? So between doing that commercial work, I've always cared about home. As you can see, when I was at university doing surf and skate and falling into that sort of social bracket, I didn't feel confident talking about where I was from, because no one from where I grew up studied art. I was such a lone fish in this big pond of eastern suburbs kids. So I felt really out of place. That's why I sort of fell into the skate and punk and music stuff, which I loved, but it never really connected with me or my friends I grew up with, So going back home in the last decade as well, or 15 years now, there's such a slew of Asian Australian creatives, people who are sort of connecting. And at the time, it sounds weird now, it was so small, mostly because of parental pressure or cultural pressure, where a lot of parents couldn't see kids out there or have confidence. But now, as time has gone on, there's such a great spans of Asian Australian artists, or people of similar struggles or upbringings and stories that can relate to myself and others as well, and vice versa. So following my illustration career and doing my personal work, I've been an exhibiting artist. So I think a big show that I did was with 4A Gallery, the show called High Medusa, and it kind of tied in my, funnily enough, my design degree, my influence of textiles, what ornamentation means, what does it mean to be Asian Australian, and have both parts of those words, have a lot of relevance and meaning, being Asian and Australian, and my personal upbringing of being in the suburbs. So it's that third culture in between. So with my work, it's really about sort of trying to remix and reinterpret tradition, but then make it very, something that speaks to the modern day that my friends can relate to, or people of my generation and the future can relate to. So it's great seeing my work, and I was so proud to have this sort of work in the Garden of Friendship. And funnily enough, having that sort of work and championing and really betting on my personal brand of storytelling and my life, more or less, led me to get awarded my first heritage artwork. So it's in Chinatown. It's in near Market City, near Tumbalong Square. And this is just before COVID started. So 2018, 2019. I, was lucky enough to be awarded this installation work based on my illustration, but then really working with the dynamics of material, installation, and engineering, things I had no idea about. So as you can see with the video, I'm really doing very little. I think the design took me 2 weeks to get signed off and approved, but the actual build was like 8 months. It was such a crazy thing to be part of. But I learned so much, and really working with another company and seeing how I could sort of answer their brief, and what the organic storytelling was of the piece. And it's important to me because it's really about championing Asian Australians and the community, and sort of the past, present, and the future of the area, which I'm really happy about. And one thing leading to another, that led to a lot more installations, which I continue to do. And every installation is a bit different, but allowing to sort of have that nuance between Asian Australian cultures, bring it together and make this sort of hyper pop, overly detailed, really hyper colorful stuff that I think speaks to the modern day. And as you can see, a bit more installations around the area, some of it a bit more commercial backed, like SPS and the galleries here. Some of it a bit more personal and storytelling, but it's really satisfying to work within the community and sort of speak to a modern story. So Neon Playground, working with Chinatown, an area I grew up, and then working with Parramatta Council, and once again, for any creators out there too, getting your work. It's really great that in the start of my career, it was really about Surrey Hills and the city, and Oxford Street, and those institutions. But it's awesome to see artists come from the suburbs, being able to tell and champion stories within the suburbs, because there's such a rich case of storytelling there. So I did this for Parramatta this year, created this installation, and it's very much, championing the suburb and the areas and the communities. And there's such a great, like, Parramatta Artist Studios, areas like that, obviously UWS, areas that really speak to, and you don't feel like you're out of place, and you can also be quite creative as well. So moving forward, personal work aside, funnily enough, betting on myself and doing my personal work along the way, because a lot of it wasn't making me money, like the advertising stuff or music videos. Now it's come full circle where, I did a job for the other year for Estee Lauder, La Mer, which is this like overly expensive moisturizing cream. And it's so expensive. I think one little jar is $600, which I didn't get, any of it free. But it's a funny thing where it's like, they were really inspired by my textiles work. So they wanted my textiles language, even in the video, to be part of the storytelling. So it's something that I never thought, with the art show, there was no budget. It was just me sort of making art for art's sake. And it's funny how things come full circle. So I do really encourage that. And following that commercially, Apple, they looked at my textiles work and my own work that I do, and they used me as part of their campaign, and championing Eastwood, something that at the start of my career, no one knew. So it was so cool to have that on billboards and to make that seen by a lot of people, and for it to resonate and mean a lot, even though it is commercial, it's cool that, it's coming back to my story, or a more personal story than just Asian storytelling. It's really important to me. And I guess a highlight in the commercial sense was kind of McDonald's, working with McDonald's, something that was very surreal. And, I was told that, especially Australia being quite conservative with McDonald's, they don't really tell many community-based stories. So it's cool that they did this sort of piece about me, this sort of promoted content and advertising campaign. But it is really about the product, the shots of the product between it. But I was able to tell a story about my grandma, my upbringing, my family, within this strange McDonald's campaign. So it's cool that they allowed this, but it's something that, doing this type of work a decade ago, it would just be like, hey, can you just draw a dragon? But now it's like, tell us the nuance, tell us where you come from, how you live, etc. So that's really special to me. Following that, in 2022, my twin brother and I, so Andrew, my twin brother, he studied media, but he's also a great illustrator. Just like myself, we both sort of draw as a hobby. That was our real passion. We always try to study different things. I guess as a twin, he tried to be different for some reason, but we always worked together. So he did media and PR, and then I did design. But then we both kind of didn't really work in our fields in the future. We kind of just went like with this. So he ended up being a producer, and we actually ended up producing for this American company, Eastern Standard Times, making these documentaries specifically on Asian Australian artists and creatives. And they were sort of started by the co-owners of an ex-exec of Facebook Asia and 88 Rising, which is this Asian American record label. So it was really flattering, and sort of tell these stories and give a platform for others, and to sort of use that creativity, not even drawing anymore, but to try and sort of continue that story in different mediums. So learning how to produce, edit, get documentaries done. And this is a small example of two of the documentaries. One is Nancy Quinn, which is a dear friend. Did a little documentary on her work.
They can't really like marry that image of me being who I am.
So just a spotlight, different nuances.
It's like a brute.
And the other one is this hardcore band called Speed, which is really popular right now, and they're good friends as well. So just to give a platform and to show the diversity and nuance of Asian Australians is really important to me. And this is the Speed documentary.
Say that it was not meant to be an Asian band. I never wanted to be tokenized.
So yeah, pretty different. But I like seeing that separation and the spans of creativity.
Brought up with a sense of confidence to express themselves in the way that hardcore guys, hard Asian man. You know what I mean?
So yeah, pretty funny. So I guess, in my career, in short, it's been so many, it's really been a case of finding my identity, whether it's, practical sense, what mediums I can offer, what stories I can tell, but really just trying to find my sense of self. A lot of it is sort of embedded within the context of the time, but also technology changing. And then now, as an adult, 35-year-old man, feeling proud about my own story, and then obviously having a community of people who can resonate and relate. So, my job now really, and to keep myself motivated, is to really just be interested and to really be curious of other stories, work in communities, work with friends, and it's such a driving force. And I do really bet on the fact of, promoting your own work artistically, doing your own core stories. And then, if you are following commercial work, that will eventually follow. But I think that really betting on your own brand of story and your own work is the strongest thing you can do for yourself. So just took me a long time to get there, very long time. But, and there have been definitely a bunch of downs as well, but that's all the good stuff, I guess. But yeah, I guess I'll stop sharing, but that's my story, guys. Thank you for listening.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris. It's a fascinating story. I always know that Chris is very articulate, and I don't know so many interesting stories. It's really fascinating, from the beginning to the end and the full circle and all the roles and all the works that you do. It made me think, like you don't drive. I don't know whether you're music or not, so you do all the things that you are not necessarily out there. Just reminds me of an actor, like actor, why they enjoy acting, because they can be in different roles. So
Yeah.
I feel like you use your artistic creation to be in a role or in a place where you may not be able to get. So kind of realize your dream. It's really fascinating. I'm just so pleased, delighted to be young, measure that we got you for this talk. And I'm sure many people will watch this. It's really interesting story that you have shared, and also the way you share your story. And I really appreciate it, not only engaging, but also quite honest And as you mentioned, transparent is you put yourself in the trust of the listeners. It's really good, and you're very brave throughout all your career. So I don't know whether you were born with it or you developed. It's just amazing. I will start with a few questions, and I'm bursting with all these questions. It's really interesting. So, which you haven't touched. So, people often see artists like you are now only when they have achieved successes, when they are showing or exhibit their artworks. But when artists struggle, when they have hardships and setbacks, they are not publicly visible. So what are the hard parts that you experience as an artist, and what are the ways of you have to overcome?
Yeah, I guess to me, whether it's a practical sense in terms of management, whether it's time management, financial management, being realistic, you do have to do part-time jobs, juggle commercial projects you might not necessarily like doing, or might be a pain, but also trying to make time for your life, your social life, which has been very important to me, being successful, trying to be social as I can, but also working on your own personal work. Because often you'll think that your personal work isn't making much traction because it won't necessarily equate to money, but it really, really pays off in a social sense, people connecting to you as an artist, but also just finding more about yourself, because, being creative is such an ongoing story. It's a creative life. Often there isn't a superannuation or a retirement plan. You just got to sort of embrace it and kind of roll with the punches in technology and everything else that comes with it.
Were there any moment you said to yourself, "Oh, this is too hard. I better go to an office, get an office job, it's a more regular,
Yeah.
unpredictable."
It's funny, like whenever I doubt, I think because I grew up as a twin and I've constantly worked with my brother, there's a lot more jobs we've done together and art projects specifically. So it's really about having a good community to just give you confidence, and also just to be real about, say you have critique, like creative critique is really important. So having a good community, and I think that there's digital friends now and communities there, but just having people you can be honest with and just to be pretty vulnerable with your work, and that will sort of get you through, just having that human support, I think.
Envious that you have a twin brother, not many people have a twin. I suppose that is like a support to each other and always there. So that to make a difference.
Yeah, for sure. And definitely gave me courage
Yeah.
when I felt alone as an Asian Australian artist,
Mm.
having more over time, because you do gravitate to each other because you have similar stories, backgrounds,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
ups and downs as well. So yeah.
Yeah. And I always have this question, because I know a lot of writers and studying literature. So writers often take their notebooks with them wherever they go, and they often note down ideas that suddenly occur to them in the midst of anything, conversation, dream, talk, sleep, meeting, walk. Do you take a notepad, maybe e-version, with you to collect inspirations along the way, or do you need to sit down to go through many drafts to get to the final one?
I actually, it's funny. I just, over time I found that, see, it's all about communication. So whether it's like uh, even an advertising job, to start off when I couldn't speak as well, I guess, I used to draw my way to communicate. Like, hey, this is my drawing. This is what makes sense of it. So back then I would sketch a lot to sort of get that raw craft better. But as I get older, especially as installation work or say an advertising job, it's really about communicating the story or what you're trying to say. So, um, so I often use just the Notes app on my phone a lot and take photos with my phone, even though it sounds like something everyone does every day. Because I date everything, I use my phone as kind of a diary. So I take photos every day, even if it's something quite mundane, like food, obviously, which is great, but something quite creative as well, just to keep track of ideas. So to me now, because I can draw pretty confidently, it's more about just taking constant notes and ideas. And even if it's tangent, doesn't make sense, just writing things down and trying to remember it all.
Oh, interesting, really interesting. You do a lot of your own work and you also commission to do work. So is there a line in your mind, when you create your own work and when you are commissioned for an artwork? Do you have a different approach?
Yeah, if it's my own personal work, I always start with story and narrative first. What is the baseline objectives? What am I trying to say? And then if it's a bit more practical sense, I think about materials, space, size, and now getting older, like, knowing budgets. That's a big, big thing that isn't very transparent, but just knowing how budgets work within animation or installation, um, fabrication, and then what you can do within those budgets, because it does help creatively with the execution. But I guess with personal work, or if it's something that's commissioned with my art sense, it always starts with the narrative. So say it's Parramatta, what is the story of Parramatta? How do I relate to it? And how can others relate to it? So it has to be authentic. It has to have some sense of myself being part of it. Why am I the one telling the story? And, I totally agree that, say there's an artwork for Melbourne, another area in Melbourne, a suburb like Summit. I don't really know the suburbs too well, but it's like definitely have someone from there say that story. And I guess for myself, why I've been able to get these jobs is because I'm telling a story that's authentic to myself. So just making sure I can relate to it, and then I can connect to the project.
In relation to this question, are there any moments when you feel you have to compromise what you want to create versus what is in the brief? So how do you resolve those conflicting feelings?
Yeah, I guess it's funny. When I was younger in my career, say I was doing a Lunar New Year project, early on in my career, I'd have to compromise a lot, mostly because these companies didn't understand what it was to be Asian Australian. They just presumed everything was Chinese, but now everything is Lunar New Year. And in terms of my upbringing in Eastwood, I went to high school with mostly Vietnamese, Vietnamese kids, Indonesian kids, Southeast Asian kids, Korean kids, and a very small Hong Kong Chinese kids, and very small percentage of Chinese kids. That would be a thing. So, really about the nuance. So, that's changed now. So with companies, there is very little backlash because you can explain and articulate. And if they're, a great company, which most often they would have to be if you want to work with them, then, they would understand your perspective and definitely listen to it, which is important. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. I suppose more people are more educated as well, culturally.
Yes, for sure. And
Yeah.
it's something that was, completely insensitive. Like, I was a bit worried about McDonald's at first. But, it's something that I probably would not do, for sure.
It's really interesting. It does look like you are very fluent with the technology. Do you utilize AI in your artistic creation? Does AI, technology enable you in realizing your artistic goals, or does it take over what you want to do as an artist and designer?
It's funny, I guess in terms of, very recently, because AI is moving so quickly, the way I've utilized AI isn't so much well, I guess for illustration, it might be like, say you're trying to find a reference. Reference is really key to illustrators. So say it's like, I need a composition of a girl sitting, a few different versions. Just have to draw a furniture picture or something. So it's good to have reference in that way. But I haven't really utilized AI for my own illustrational work. But I have utilized it for advertising with the treatments. So, a lot of the advertising work is about writing the ideas in the story. And, me and my brother, we brainstorm a lot of ideas, like what are the ideas? So we brainstorm our key ideas. And I think my brother is sorry, not to throw him under the bus. He's really dyslexic. He's dyslexic. So he uses AI to sort of fix his grammar, like Grammarly and that kind of thing. So we do help it to sort of finesse our treatment statements, just to make it make more sense. Because AI has a weird language that isn't quite
But
great.
just a general view as an artist, are you concerned about AI, or are you delighted by the development of AI?
I guess it's hard to say. As an illustrator, it's a bit scary because AI is so rapid in terms of what it's doing for the illustration itself and the art of it. That being said, I don't know any illustrator that it's taken their jobs per se yet, because people are pretty savvy to AI work. But I guess, just knowing my career and being able to get into these different doors, being flexible and allowing technology to be part of my art making, I'd probably have to give it a go just because, I remember when I was first an illustrator, they were like, no, if you don't know ink drawing, you cannot be an illustrator. We cannot take you seriously. So, and when I started drawing a tablet, it was looked down upon. But, that was a big step for me as a kid and trying to overcome that. So it'll be utilized with, but then, there's always that scary anxiety between it. The future is it's open. So I'm not quite sure, to be honest. It's two sides of it.
You do a lot of design and animation, especially for bigger brands. Are you conscious of inclusive designing? So meaning when you design, you're thinking of all users, including gender, age, people with disability. So do you have that on your mind when you do the design?
Yes, it's so important. And I think that, especially now, because if I'm doing a directing, like live action directing, and having a bit more of a senior role with producing and doing, planning the animation and then being able to have the power to hire, is definitely hiring responsibly. So if the story is about people with disabilities, then, finding talent or actors who fall into that category. Obviously, for myself, being on the other side of it, in the past where I've done like, oh, hey, this is a Chinese film or animation, but everyone here is not Asian. I always try and hire true to the nuance of the story that's we're trying to tell, but also just morally. It makes more sense and it gives people opportunity, which is something that wasn't as visible early in my career, which is really, really important to me. So opportunity and then truth in storytelling.
This is a kind of a fun question, but can be loaded. You mentioned quite a lot about the identity, about being Asian Australian, and being especially Asian Australian artist. And well, there were in the olden days or earlier, there were not that many sort of a consciousness of it. So this is a question. I had worked at Victims Compensation Tribunal at New South Wales Attorney General's Department for 10 years as a compensation manager in charge of the largest section of the tribunal. But funnily, and this question always annoys me because whenever I mention, oh, I had worked at an Attorney General's Department of Victims Compensation Tribunal for 10 years, the response always, without failing, as the interpreter and translator, so can I do something else? So, like obviously there is a kind of a judgmental there. What are the questions that are you being asked that you found annoying?
Yeah, I guess luckily as an artist and illustrator, there hasn't been too many ones that have been problematic. But to me, when Andrew and I started producing and representing EST Media, which was this, Asian Australian storytelling, which is, you saw it, is about creators and Asian Australian and that identity and nuance, and mostly the suburbs, right? But we did this panel with a whole bunch of other media companies like Vice, few of the newspapers and that kind of thing. And, we talked about our stories and what we do. And this question this guy kept asking, so what is China's thoughts on this? What does China think about this? And I'm like, that's not what we're doing. That's not our job. We don't know. We're not representing China, the country. We're talking about Asian Australian storytelling. So I think there is still there can still be a bit of that gap in understanding. And that's, to me at the time, this is quite recent too. It's still a bit of a battle, but it just gives you a bit more sense like, okay, what we're doing is great. There's still something to be changed and shifted, especially with an older generation or something that could be a bit more corporate and not the people we see every day. People still don't understand. So we do get asked questions often about China. And I'm like, I was Asian, I was born here. My story is very transparent. I can't speak on the behalf of a country that, it's a bit tricky. But yeah.
Oh, that's a great example. It's a great example. It's kind of funny, but it's also loaded in many ways, so it's really interesting. Last question. As a person, as an artist, as a young man, are you concerned about the world affairs, the way the world is currently going? Are you optimistic that the general good of humanity will prevail?
Oh yeah, it's very concerning. It's very concerning, and it's very stressful. But I mean, I've got to be optimistic. You know, I've been optimistic my whole career. And often when I started, you know, not knowing who I was, at my age is also my identity and culture. Um, it's really easy to give up, you know, trying art, doing things that you think is great art or people can respond to. And for me, it did pay off. It takes time, but it did pay off. So I have to be consistently optimistic. And I guess now, you know, working with communities, working with a greater sense of people, you do feel like you're making a difference, or trying to, and you know, always trying to be as open-minded as you can, and always being open to listen, and not knowing, you know, like even when I started doing music videos or anything like that, I had no idea. I have such a sense of dread and imposter syndrome my whole career. But in terms of the world's beliefs and what's happening, you're just trying to be optimistic. And I think that's how I've, you know, besides community and friends, been able to navigate my career, trying to be optimistic and open-minded.
It's really, really interesting, Chris. I can't enjoy more. And your talk and your answers is really interesting. I would be very keen to have you back in 5 years, and then you will have a lot more interesting stories. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chris, for the wonderful stories that you have shared with us. Thank you. And also, I thank everyone for attending the talk and for everyone's support. So if you are an artist and you would like to share your story in this series, please contact me. And you may also recommend artists who have interesting stories to share. So thank you, Chris, again, and see you next time, everyone. Until then, have a good evening.
Everyone, catch you later. Thanks, Jane.